Your core muscles are different to the muscles of your limb, so you've got to train them differently. What we're going to do in this tutorial is talk a little bit about the anatomy. We're going to talk about some principles of movement. So what we can then do is base our exercise selection on some fundamental anatomy and some functional anatomy by talking about essentially how it's designed and how it works. So what basically then happens is the exercises choose themselves. Principle number one is core muscles prevent movement. So what that basically means is you've got rectus abdominis, internal external obliques, QL, TVA, spinal erectors. So you've got all these different muscles. Now what most people think is that my abdominals are designed to flex here. And we're going to talk about this in a second. My back extensors are there to extend here. My obliques are there to twist here. My QL is there to bend here. Therefore, I need to train them like that. But what we're going to discover in the next part is that that isn't the case. And what is the case is that these core muscles work as one unit. So your rectus abdominis, your obliques, spinal erectors, TVA, QL, they're all working together as one unit. And essentially what we're doing is we're taking that principle and we're transferring it out into exercises and saying, right, what exercises make the majority of my torso work so they are preventing movement here? Because if we get movement at the torso or at the spine, then it's what could be described as an energy leak. Now that doesn't mean these little sort of short pulses of movement, because there is a place for that, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what we're talking about is this very sort of loose type of flexion, extension type creating movement at the spine, which is the ineffective way of doing it. So what it basically looks like, if I grab this weight here and I pass it round, I can stay solid. So everyone's thinking, well, yeah, that's obvious. But if this weight gets heavier, what might start to happen is I start to sort of fling it. As I weaken and the weight obviously stays the same, I then start using my spine to pass it around. That's an ineffective way of doing it. It's ineffective for performance and it's increasing risk of injury. So what we need to be able to do is hold this solid, and then what's happening essentially is the tension as the weight moves is being transferred around the torso, and we're getting a much more effective movement when it's coupled with principle number two, which we're going to talk about next. And it is that the limbs create the movement. So you saw in the last exercise what was happening was my arms were doing the movement, my torso was acting like a solid platform so the arms could do that controlled movement. So if we take some slightly faster exercises, one being a kettlebell swing, again, we don't want to get the power from the spine because they're ineffective muscles to gain power. So it's poor for performance, but it's also increasing your risk of injury. So it's much more effective where we've got glute max assisted by hamstrings, which is going to be much more effective to then swing the weight. So I'm not bending my spine, which just isn't as effective. I'm able to pop my hips that much more, which is a much more effective way of moving a heavy weight. So if we can use that, so we can start using glute max as the power generators, held in place by a solid torso, which is abdominals, obliques, spinal erectors, QL, even to some degree lats as well, holding that into position, then we're going to be much more effective when it comes to everyday life, sporting performance, and fitness in general. Part number two, we're going to talk quickly about the function of muscles and how limb muscles are different to core muscles. So what we've got when it comes to function of muscles are things called agonists, antagonists, synergists, and fixators. I'm just going to focus on agonists and antagonists. Now, in the limbs, there are agonists and antagonists. So an agonist is the prime mover. So if I was stood here and then I lift my heel off the floor, The agonist for that, the prime mover, is the hamstring. The antagonist is the opposing muscle. So if I then essentially go 180 degrees from the back of my leg to the front of my leg, it's the quadricep muscle. So I've got the antagonist, the prime mover, flexing the knee, so that's getting shorter. The one that's getting longer is the quad. Now what's happened is it's been taken, or these labels have been taken up into the core. So what we do is we say, well, the rectus abdominis is the agonist of spine flexion. Therefore, the spinal erectors are the antagonist. So we've created the same mindset for choosing exercises for the core as we have the hips. But what we've just found out is that the torso and the muscles of the torso are there to prevent movement, control movement, create a solid platform for the hips to create their movement. So what we have to understand is that in some respects there are no agonists and antagonists throughout the torso, because we're trying to keep them as one unit. So when this one contracts, we want this one to contract, not because we want it to move, but because we want it to hold down like guy wires. So if we can imagine the spine as the sail, or the pole for the sail, and the muscles are the guy wires that attach to the boat, what we're essentially doing is allowing that spine to stay up tall by using these guy wires evenly to keep it up tall, because we want similar tension. We want 50-50 tension on the left and right and on the back and front, because if we have 70-30 tension on the front, the spine's going to buckle forwards. If we've got 70-30 tension on the back, it's going to buckle backwards. We don't want that for movement. We want solid torso and then the hips or the shoulders to do the movement, because that's where we're going to get the greatest power from, because we've got the bigger muscles doing it. Glute max for the hips, lats and pecs for the shoulders. They're very good at generating power, and the torso ones are very good at holding strong. For the very simple reason is they're like carbon fibre. All the fibres go in different directions. When they contract, they lock solid. So if we can create that, we're going to be in a much more effective position when it comes to choosing the right exercises. But understanding why we're doing it comes down to the limbs are different than the torso muscles. So to summarise how core muscles are different to limb muscles, and therefore we need to choose different exercises, is number one, muscles of the torso are there to prevent movement. They are there to work as one unit. So we've got abdominals, which people think, well, I need to do crunches for. Incorrect. We've got an agonist, which is the abdominals, which we've got an antagonist for, which is the erector spinae. Again, incorrect. It's rectus abdominis on the front, obliques on the side, erector spinae at the back are acting as our guy wires to hold the spine down onto the pelvis to keep this solid, so we can have fast movement from the limbs or from the hips, from the shoulders, which can then translate out into everyday life, fitness environment like a gym, or a sporting environment like an event or a game or a competition or whatever it is that you do. So we have to understand that, which then brings us on to the limbs, where we do have agonist, hamstring, antagonist, quad. If I'm going from this position and extending the knee, this is my agonist, the quad, and this is my antagonist, because this one's shortening, this one's lengthening. So the antagonist always opposes. So all muscles are an antagonist, all muscles are an agonist, or certainly the ones of the limb anyway, because one will create movement and they always have an opposing one. So we have to understand that. But what that does for the limbs is that helps us choose exercises. So when we're extending the knee, we're working the quad. When we're flexing the knee, we're working the hamstring. But when we're working the torso, we want this solid. So essentially, there are no agonists, antagonists, synergists, or fixators. So we have to understand that. Once we do, we can then start choosing more effective exercises, and that is therefore then going to take us into a more effective way of moving and performing